the session is being recorded today, so you don't need to take copious notes as we go along, and if you miss a bit, then that's fine. We can always go back on that. And also, if can I ask you, if you're not speaking, just to mute yourself, because otherwise we pick up a little bit of background noise and feedback. If you have any questions as well during the course of the session as we go along, could you pop those questions in the chat? Then whichever of us is not presenting, we'll try and keep an eye on things. If we can answer a question as we go along, that's fine, but if not, we'll gather those and then have a chat at the end of the session. So if you just bear with me one moment, I'm going to share with you the presentation now. Okay, Kate, can we see the presentation? I'm getting a thumbs up from across the office, which is very helpful, being in the same room. So as I say, this is about an introduction to the toolkit, and it's really for those of you who are perhaps just starting out on the journey, not really sure what actually going through the toolkit involves or what it's all about, or indeed what the benefits are, because the NHS and other bodies are telling you you should register and you should sign up, which is great, but it's always handy to have an understanding as to the whys and wherefores and how it will benefit your care setting as we move forward. So I've introduced myself and Kate, and as we go along, if you like to introduce yourselves, if you actually ask a question, or you can always pop your information in the chat as well. So we're going to be talking about the Better Security, Better Care program as we go along, which is what the DSPT is part of. The registration process as well, taking you through a step-by-step approach to actually getting registered. That's probably the most important element of today's presentation, because registration on the toolkit will open a number of doors to other programs and initiatives, including things like NHS Mail and Proxy Access. As we move forward into a more digital sort of care environment, registering on the toolkit is absolutely vital for reasons I'll explain later on. We'll look at the benefits as well, how it can actually help you in tangible ways as a provider. And then we'll really get into the sort of a little bit of detail around the contents of the toolkit. And Kate will explain to you the 4 themes that the toolkit's broken down into, the questions that form part of those themes. And then basically we can talk about next steps and how to move forward. So what is Better Security, Better Care? Well, it's a large initiative, a national program that's funded by NHSX. NHSX is really the digital arm of the NHS. And the purpose of the program in its simplest form is to make sure that adult social care providers have good cybersecurity in place. And if you think about it, the sort of data that you're handling on a day-to-day basis, things like residents' personal information or medical records, is all very, very sensitive. And so it's vital that that data is kept safe and secure, and that you and your team know exactly what you should be doing to keep that data safe, and there's no breaches, and that you're actually complying with legislation as well. So by registering on the toolkit, you can demonstrate good practice to potential funders and contract providers as well. So there's also a business imperative to getting involved with this particular initiative. One thing I'd like to say up front is that the level of support that's available for this program is excellent. And I'm not just saying that because we're a partner in it. I've seen many programs come and go, many initiatives, and there's a wealth of resources, fact sheets, guidance, videos via digitalsocialcare.co.uk. So if you feel that you're struggling as you go through the toolkit, then don't worry, there's help available, both from the national site and from ourselves at Care Development East. And I'll explain later how to contact us if you need our help. So first of all, I'm going to talk about the registration process. And as I say, we're recording the session anyway, so don't worry if you miss any of these steps out. And indeed, when you go into the Digital Care UK website, it will talk you through these steps anyway. So first and foremost, you need to go to DSPT toolkit.nhs.uk. You need a valid email address and you need your organisation data service code. Now, if you're not sure what your ODS code is or whether you even have one, you should have an ODS code. Certainly, if you are CQC registered, you're likely to have an ODS code. If you've been using things like NHS Mail, the same applies. But you can always find out. And if you type in, just do a web search, ODS portal, you can look your organisation up. And if you don't have one, it's fairly easy to access. When you initially register, you will get an automated email come back, and you must respond to that within 24 hours and set up your password. Now, there's two things to say here. Whoever does this registration process will then be the administrator in the eyes of the Data Security Toolkit providers. So it's important you agree that and think about it beforehand. The next point, and I will stress this throughout the presentation, is about setting up your password. Please don't use the name of your business and then just sort of 1, 2, 3, 4 or something very simple like that. It's really concerning how many people are still using very simple passwords, and you're falling at the first hurdle really with this program if you don't have a think about that. In terms of cybersecurity, a really useful approach is to use 3 random words to basically develop a password that's strong, it's difficult to break down, and it will just keep your data set safe and secure as you move forward. So this is the screen that appears. As I say, you'll need your ODS code and your email address. And then when you start to enter the information, there's a captcha code displayed. You just enter the captcha code and then you continue through. Just pop in your details there as well. Very briefly, email, first name, telephone is optional, just in case you want any support. And as I say, the invitation is time limited, so check your spam, check your email addresses that you pick up on that. Click on the link within 24 hours where it says register and activate the invitation. So it's all fairly simple, fairly straightforward. And I mentioned the help and support that's available here. As it says, there's a helpline, which is helpful, and I'm not being sort of sarcastic, but it really is a sort of a useful resource, and you will get some help and advice. And alternatively, the email help desk, which is the address is provided here, is also, you can get a fairly quick turnaround if you're having any problems in terms of registration or anything else to do with the toolkit. I mentioned about passwords. Please use a really strong password. If you think about it, the information you'll be entering in the toolkit is in itself sensitive. So please, as I say, use those 3 random words. Make sure that it's a secure password, and then you'll be okay when you're in those stages of setup. Your organizational profile, when you start setting that up, again, it's very intuitive. It guides you through the process. It'll ask you how you actually choose or which category best describes your organization. And typically you'll be putting something like social care in there. But if it's not social care, look at some of the other drop downs that are available. And then once you've done that, you can start to add other users within the organization. Now, I just want to talk about other users, because the toolkit in itself is not something you have to do in one go. And as with all projects, you can break the project down into tasks and assign those tasks to the most appropriate people in your organization. So for example, if you've got somebody in your organization who's responsible for the people side of things and the HR, it would probably be useful to give them a level of access for when you're addressing the section of the toolkit that deals with people and HR, staffing and roles and responsibilities. So you could make that person a member, you could assign them member permissions, and then that would enable them to actually add any evidence or to go through any questions and to edit, but that's all they could do. So they can add and edit evidence, but then they couldn't sort of do anything else with the toolkit. The administrator, self-explanatory. You can manage all the users, you can confirm any evidence that's provided as well. And then when everything is in place, you can actually publish as well. And the auditor, you might say, well, who do I need to include as an auditor? It may well be that the owner of a care home is interested in this process, or board members as well. If you have a board, like our business, we have a board of directors, and if you wanted them to see the toolkit but not to be able to add anything, just to check progress, it is possible to actually do that and to just assign a view only set of permissions. So I talked a little bit about the toolkit and registration. What is it in essence? What is the toolkit that's been talked about, and which certain bodies, including ourselves, are saying you must sign up to this? Well, it's an online self-assessment of your organization's data security. It's something that is demonstrating good practice, but it's also something that's demonstrating that you're complying with data protection legislation. So this is things like GDPR and the Data Protection Act. By completing the toolkit, it actually shows that you're thinking through these processes, you've got these procedures in place, and you are complying with the law in respect of data management. It's something that's reviewed annually as well. So the data protection toolkit is not something that you just do and then think, right, we can go on to the next initiative or we can go on to the next job. It is an annual review. You do need to keep those the self-assessment going, and that makes sense really. It's good business sense, because you should always be reviewing your security. You should always be looking at your data management to see your records are up to date and that you're not holding on to data you shouldn't have. So annual reviews, absolutely essential. You don't have to do the toolkit all in one go, incidentally. So as I said a moment ago, you can break it down into tasks for individuals. You don't have a time limit in terms of completion, and so you can actually sort of take a more gradual approach to completing the toolkit. You don't have to assign a date and then do it all in one go. And the other thing, just on a final point on this slide, is that it gives you advice, and it's a checklist of good practice. So it's not like a stick to beat you over the head with. It's not some sort of legal set of guidelines that you have to comply with, although of course it is talking about legislation. It also gives you some pointers as well and says, well, if you haven't got this process in place, you might like to think about it. If you have staff taking mobile devices off site with confidential information, you might like to think about password protection. So inbuilt within the toolkit is advice and guidance that enables you to put in place good practice within your care setting. Why do you need to pay attention to the toolkit? Well, data and cybersecurity is absolutely critical in terms of sharing individual data. especially as we've seen during the pandemic. So digital technology is being used more and more. We've got things like NHS Mail, you've got things like Proxy Access, which enables access to medical records and information, and keeping people's data safe is absolutely paramount. Kate will talk later on about some of the sort of, the processes and procedures that you actually need. But you hear these horror stories on the news sometimes of people leaving a file on a train or just leaving a phone and they haven't password protected it, and there's all this sensitive data on there. You don't want to be the ones who are caught out. Your business can be fined if you have a data breach, and those fines can be pretty eye-watering. So you do want to make sure that you've got everything locked down and that you're not going to be the victim of the next cyber attack. And I think some smaller institutions think, well, we're not likely to be the target, but you'd be surprised. And anybody who wants to, if they find a weakness in the system, could actually disrupt and cause an awful lot of sort of disruption to your business. DSPT, as we move forward, we're finding more and more is helping to demonstrate compliance with not just legal things like GDPR, but also the requirements of CQC in terms of their inspections. And it's becoming a key area to demonstrate the safe management of data. So again, registering on the DSPT actually helps you with the whole process of CQC inspection as well moving forward. And again, looking to the future, when we think about things like contractual requirements and the renewal of contracts from county councils, the toolkit will start to become more and more a requirement in terms of securing any work or actually sort of engaging with people in healthcare or within local authorities. The toolkit on the final point is a passport to shared care records. So when I talked earlier on about the Better Security, Better Care program, the toolkit is just one of many initiatives that are being pursued at the moment. Proxy Access is one, NHS Mail is another. There's work going on with within the primary care networks as well. And so this particular program will open doors in terms of you being able to participate in some of these other health services. And it's not a case of me saying, well, you do it and then you can do more initiatives, because that doesn't exactly sound appealing, but it opens doors. It actually then enables you to, it helps make life easier, and you'll be part of a truly joined up care network with, and that will improve patient care at the end of the day. So just to summarize how the toolkit can actually help you moving forward, you can use the toolkit as evidence. It will actually help with the CQC key lines of inquiry. I've already mentioned that as we move forward, they'll be looking at organizations to have the toolkit in place, to have at least worked through the basics. And so that's one good reason for getting involved. The other is the legal side of things, GDPR and the Data Protection Act. It shows that you have put in place the correct systems, the correct processes to comply with the requirements of the Act. And contracts. As we move forward, all of us will be wanting to renew contracts with funders. We'll be wanting to sort of look at additional work, I'm sure. And the toolkit will be a requirement. People will want to make sure that you've got your data and your systems safe and secure, and that the people who work for you understand that the sensitivity of some of the information that you hold. So it builds trust, it keeps your data safe, it reduces organizational risk and prevents data breaches, and it also gives you guidance as well, and opens doors, as I mentioned, to things like NHS Mail, GP Connect, and other care records as well. So it's not just about a compliance exercise. It's not just about this big stick I mentioned earlier on. It'll help you and your staff save time, and it'll improve care for the people that you're actually supporting. So the journey, this is where we're going to start to move into breaking the toolkit down for you and explaining what you actually need to do and some of the question areas that you'll need to actually address as we move forward. So I've talked a fair bit about the registration process. It's fairly straightforward, it's fairly intuitive, and as I say, if you do get stuck, there are sources of help and advice available. Now, once you've registered and you're about to embark on the journey, you've basically got two approaches you can take. In total, there are 45 questions in total, which comprise the toolkit. Now, you could decide that you're going to assign responsibility to one or two individuals in your care setting and say, right, your project for this month is to do the toolkit. And they can then focus on going through all of the questions in one go, answering all 4 question sets, providing all of the evidence, and then go straight to standards met. The alternative approach, though, which probably sounds more appealing, is to go for approaching standards, because for some of the initiatives I mentioned with regard to the NHS, there's just a requirement that you are approaching standards on the toolkit. And for that, you need to answer 27 of the questions, but then you also need to map out an action plan of what you intend to do to answer the remaining questions. So what steps you will take, what evidence you will put in place to actually then achieve standards met. So you need to come up with an action plan, and what we can provide you with after today's session is a sort of an example action plan that would help you to map that out. So you could do the 27 questions, and then you could publish at approaching standards. So as I say, if you do that, you can then get secure NHS mail, and then once you've got your plan in place, you can move forward to standards met, and that opens even more doors for you as you actually move forward. So I'm going to pause for breath now, and we're going to start to look at the actual questions and the groups that they sit within under the 4 headings. So I'm going to hand over to Kate now.
Hello. So we're just going to have a brief overview of the contents of the actual toolkit. So as Christian mentioned earlier on, the actual toolkit is grouped under 4 headings. So you've got staffing and roles, policies and procedures, data security, and IT systems and devices. So as you can see, each group has a number of questions you have to complete in order to meet approaching standards. And then there are additional questions that you need to complete to get standards met. Thank you. So again, Christian talked about the journey to approaching standards. So there are the 27 mandatory questions, and these are the ones you need to complete in order to publish under approaching standards. If you want to, you can complete the 27 questions and then do a few additional questions. That's not a problem. But in order to publish for the first time under approaching standards, you do need to complete the 27 mandatory questions. Once you have answered those questions, you'll then need to download a copy of the action plan and complete an action plan which shows how you're going to meet the remaining questions. And then you need to upload that action plan along with the questions already completed. And then you get the option to publish at approaching standards. Thank you. So as you can see on the screen now, this is a screenshot of the social care view. So you can see that the questions are there in blue. So the questions that are for approaching standards that are mandatory are indicated in the list. So you can see there down there, staff and roles, they've got the 3 mandatory questions there. So you don't have to complete this toolkit, as Christian said, in any particular order. You can answer a couple in staff and roles, a couple in policies and procedures, and then go backwards and forwards. Again, like Christian said, you can break the tasks down. So you give one person the responsibility for staffing and roles, another person responsibility for the policies and procedures, and that's not a problem. You might find when you start answering the questions that you have some information, but not all the information. So you might write down the information that you've got so far and then go back to it at a later date to fully complete the question. But the one thing I will say is you won't be able to change it once it's published. So if you do think you're going to need to change it and add to it, you need to make sure that you don't publish until it's completed. So under each section of the questions, it will ask you for some evidence. So this might be something as simple as a date. It might be a yes or no tick box answer, or it might require you to upload some evidence sort of regarding policies and procedures. So this is an example of a question. So you can see at the top, it actually has the question. So who is responsible for data security and protection? And how has this responsibility been formally assigned? Underneath that question, you then have a tooltip. So this is kind of guidance on best practice. So do make sure you read through this, because this will give you an idea of actually what you're meant to be achieving within this question. You then have the yellow box, which is where you write your answer. And then you have the additional comments box underneath. Now, this is an optional box to fill in, but you might find it's really useful to put in information about where you found this, or where this evidence is kept. So if it's in a filing cabinet or in a particular file on the computer, or where you gather this information from, because as we mentioned earlier, this is an annual assessment, so you will need to come back to do this again and again. And if you put comments in the box that allow you to kind of remember where the information is, you'll find it a lot easier to complete in the future. Thank you. So the actual contents of the toolkit then. So the first section is staffing and roles. So these questions cover things like who has responsibility for different kind of data protection and cybersecurity areas within your organization. Now, some staff may have very limited access and other staff will have quite a big responsibility within this. So it's about making sure that you have defined responsibilities for different roles within the organization, so everybody knows where they stand with that. So you've got staff records and contracts. So it's about making sure that you've got a record of all the staff that you have within your organization, and that their contracts cover standards, which means they have responsibility for keeping data safe. And it's really important that you have that within their contracts. And then you've got data protection and cybersecurity induction and training. So as we said before, different staff will have different levels of responsibility. So that means that the level of training that they require is going to vary. So it's really important that you would do a training and a needs analysis to understand, what level of training each member of staff needs, because you don't want to be giving them very complex training when they have very limited access. And the same if you've got somebody that has a massive responsibility within cybersecurity and data protection, you need to make sure that they are competent and they have all the information they need in order to fulfill their role. Thank you. So as we mentioned, part of the toolkit requires you to have a list of all the staff that are involved in your organisation. And this will include employed staff as well as volunteers and people like board members as well. And it's important that you keep a track of who is with you and what their role is, and change it as their role changes, because you will get staff that, obviously move within the organisation from one role to another. So you might use something like your new starters checklist in order to kind of put this information together. But it's also important that as you have staff that leave the organisation, that list is updated to show who's left. So something like your existing payroll or rotary system might be where you would have a full list of all the staff within your organisation. Now, the toolkit requires you to have a list. It doesn't require you to upload it on the system. So you literally just need to indicate that you do indeed have a list. But this is where you might want to use something like the comments box. In the comments box, you can just mention whereabouts that list is. So when you go to do it again in the future, you know exactly where to go, and you can check that this list is still in place and it's still up to date. Thank you. So policies and procedures. So there are 11 questions within this group, and 10 of which are required for approaching standards. So this section covers things like information, Commissioner's Office registration. It covers things like your policy and procedures, so what you need to have in place to make sure your data is held safe and secure. But it will also cover how you make sure that these policies and procedures are working. So the audits that you do to make sure that they are being followed, and the spot checks as well that are in place to make sure that staff know what they're doing, and that the policies and procedures are still valid and working for you. So it also covers holding and sharing information. So that's sort of what documentation do you have in place? And what do you have in place to be GDPR compliant? So that's things like your information asset register, or your record of processing activities, and things like your privacy notice as well. So it's all those things that you must have in place to be GDPR compliant. It also looks at what you do with retaining records, because obviously different records need to be retained for different lengths of time. So it's about making sure that you have that documented so staff know what needs to be kept for how long. It looks at how you dispose of your records and your equipment. So that's the safe disposal of highly confidential information, and what you do with like your office equipment, your computers, etc., once you're upgraded and they are no longer useful. And then it also requires you to have a list of suppliers. So this is any organizations that you work with and handle personal information. So it could be people like care planning systems, or people that support you with IT. It could be accountancy or HR and payroll services. So it's making sure that you have a list of their suppliers, and what service you actually receive from them as well. Thank you. So one of the questions they ask in this section is, what is your organisation's Information Commissioner's Officer registration number? And this is actually quite a simple question to answer, because it is literally just putting your registration number in place. So next slide. So the ICO, or the Information Commissioner's Office, is the UK's independent authority set up to uphold the information rights in public interest and promoting openness by public bodies and data privacy. So the important thing is that you must have registration, or must be registered with the ICO. It is a legal requirement. And if you're not registered, your organisation could be fined up to £4,000. If you can see on the screen now, you can check whether or not you are registered and get your registration number by simply entering in your information. So that is quite a simple question. It's literally just putting in a registration number for this one. Thank you. So data security. So this is the third section. So this is looking at things like your data breaches. So what constitutes a data breach? What is a near miss? And what plans do you have in place should you have any near misses or data breaches? So the good thing about this is that 3 of the questions are actually on how you coped once you did have a data breach. So if you haven't had any data breaches, that's 3 questions you don't need to answer, and you can just put not applicable. This area also covers your physical security, so that's like your buildings, and also what you do with paper records on the move. So that's if you have to take a person's personal notes off-site, for example, if you're going on a home visit or you're taking them to a hospital appointment. So how do you make sure that you keep those records safe? It also covers business continuity. So this is how you make sure all the information you need to keep your business operating and running on a daily basis is secure should something happen. So if, for example, if you keep timetables or rotas on the computer, what happens if your computer system breaks down, or I don't know, there's an interruption to your internet access, so you can't physically access those records on the computer? What plans do you have in place to make sure that your staff turn up with the different clients that they are assigned to at the right time? So it's making sure you have continuity plans in place for when things go wrong. It's also important as well, not only to have those plans in place, but to make sure that you audit those systems to make sure that they actually work. So your physical security, like we said before, is about the security of your buildings and offices. So it's about keeping people's data safe within the physical environment. So this is where you have kind of controls in place like filing cabinets, keypads that require a code in order to get into specific areas of the building, and is limited to only those that need to access those areas as well. And like I said, it also covers what you do when your information has to leave the building for whatever reason, and how you keep that safe, because people's cars are not a safe place to store information. You know, they're often broken into, they can be stolen, and then that person's personal information is out there and unprotected. So an example of some of the questions they ask around this is briefly describe the physical controls your building have in place that prevent unauthorized access to personal data. So this is, like we said, lockable doors, lockable windows, making sure you have lockable cupboards or filing cabinets. It would also include things like having a clear desk procedure, so people aren't leaving clients' personal or staff's personal information lying around. It's about security badges as well, and about how you limit access to those that don't need to be within that area. And then you've got the second question, which is, how does your organisation make sure that paper records are protected when they're out of the building? So that, again, could be something as simple as if your staff do take a client to a hospital appointment, or they do go on a home visit to meet a client, they don't leave any personal information in the car. They have a bag and they take that information with them, and that information is with them, on their person throughout that visit and not left unattended. Thank you. So the final section is IT systems and devices. So this covers things like the different staff members, their job roles and who has access to information, as well as, the different people that you have within your organization and the different types of records you need to protect. It's about passwords. So your policies on passwords, how often you change them, what your passwords need to be made up of to make sure that they are strong passwords, any backup systems that you have in place. It's about covering protecting your devices. So you might have some staff that have to use their own smartphones as part of their role. So it's about making sure you have a policy, for example, like bring your own device policy in place to protect any information that's on your staff's device. It covers as well things like your technical setup and support. So do you have things like antivirus software? Do you make sure that your operating systems are always up to date and therefore protected? As well as keeping information and documentation about your suppliers. So what their roles and responsibilities are within handling information regarding people within your organization. So it's really important to know what staff have access to what information, and that you keep a track of that access. And you make sure that, when staff change their roles, that information is updated. So you always are aware of who you need to go to should there be a data breach. It's also important to keep things like your emergency contacts for staff up to date as well, and that information is kept in a secure place with a hard copy. So some of the questions that this this area covers does your organisation know who has access to personal and confidential data through its IT systems? So like I said before, it's about knowing who has access to what and making sure that you have that documented. Now, some organisations, maybe some of the smaller organisations, might have something like a shared login. And it's important that you actually start working to find an alternative to that shared login, because it's very difficult to track if there are any issues or data breaches if you have a shared login system. So yeah, so it's about looking at your access and making sure you know who has access to what. The second question is, does your organisation have a reliable way of removing or amending people's access to IT systems when they leave or change roles? So this might be a procedure you have within your leavers system when you have a staff member leave. I know lots of people have paperwork where it shows who has access to what IT systems, so you can then use that information to remove them from the systems as they leave. Or also that form can be used as people change roles and the systems they need to access will change. So it's making sure, again, you have that procedure in place. 4.3.1. So have all the administrators of your organisation's IT systems signed an agreement to hold them accountable to higher standards. So people within your organisation that have access to IT kind of administrator responsibilities will obviously have a greater access to a greater amount of knowledge. It's therefore really important that you make sure that they are held accountable for that level of responsibility. So that's making sure that you have information in their contracts that state that they have that level of accountability. It's also important that any external contractors also have their level of accountability within your contracts with them to make sure that they know what their role and responsibilities are. And then finally, like we said earlier, the emergency contacts. So that's making sure that they are kept secure, but also because it's an emergency contact and your systems might fail, you need to have a hard copy available for, in case of an emergency. So that was a very whistle-stop tour of the type of questions that you will be asked within the toolkit. So as you can see, some of them are actually quite simple to answer and not very involved, but some questions will be a little bit more in depth. So things around some of the policies and procedures, it will obviously state the kind of information you must have in your policy and procedure. And if that doesn't comply with what you have in place, you will need to go through your normal systems for making those changes. And sometimes that can take a bit of time, depending on your organization's processes. And things like as well, making sure that you have the right information in individuals' contracts of employment. That again is something that sometimes can take a little bit of time to change. So I suggest that when you start looking at the toolkit, you do have a quick look through all the questions just to see the ones you can answer quickly and the ones that will take a little bit longer. And to make sure you don't leave the ones that are going to take a little longer to deal with until the end, because you need to start having the ball rolling to make those changes that are required in order to be compliant. Thank you, Christian.
Okay, I'm just going to stop sharing the presentation for one moment and just give us a opportunity to handle any questions at all at this point. So I say we'll come back to the actual registration in a moment. I'll just pick up on one point that was made in the chat, which is about the use of third parties. So you might decide again that this is a piece of work which you've got quite a lot on your plate, so you might actually want to work with a third party to consult and advise you as you work your way through the toolkit, and that's fine, but you will have to do the registration as the host organization, because essentially it's you who will have the ODS code in place, and you're also most likely to be using things like NHS Mail at the end of the day. So if you do want to use a consultant or you do want to use a third-party advisor, not a problem, but you must register and then assign them a role, maybe as a member or as a fellow administrator within that context. So that's just picking up on that point. Does anybody else have any other questions at this particular point? You'll probably think of them, as is always the case, at the end of the presentation, and you think, oh, I wish I'd asked about this particular issue. I think what we would say at this point, before we get into sort of next steps, is don't think of this as one big project. The questions themselves, they will require a level of work. You will have to go away and find some evidence. Hopefully some of the things that the toolkit asks about are things that you already have in place. So it's highly likely that you'll have done a bit of work around the Data Protection Act because it's an existing piece of legislation. It's not brand new. It's highly likely that you'll have staff files and personnel records. But what the toolkit will make you do is to revisit those. And if you've got records for people who've already left the organization, or if they still have email access, for example, that's a classic, you need to make sure that you have a system in place to address that and delete those permissions and change that. Just picking up again, yes, it's possible to receive the presentation. We'll send a link to the recording when we're completed today. So what I will do then is I will just carry on for the moment with the slides. There's not too many to go now. Okay, so next steps. Register. We've already talked about registration. That's really the sort of preliminary that you need to do. Get your registration done. Once your registration's done, then you can map out what you're going to do. Decide whether you want to go down the route of approaching standards and answer the 27 mandatory questions, or whether you want to take on the project as a whole and then just work your way through it systematically. That's fine. That's not an issue. Review the action plan that you have in place. So if you go for the route of approaching standards in particular, this applies. You'll have your action plan. Make sure you've set out what you need to do. If there are any areas that are immediately obvious as requiring attention, so as Kate mentioned, you might have staff going off site taking sensitive data. What do you intend to do about that? How will you actually mitigate that risk? Make sure you've set that out in your action plan. Now, the original intention of this program was that organizations publish by the 30th of June this year. What with the pandemic and 101 other things going on at the moment, it won't surprise you to know that that has now been pushed. So they're looking at possibly extending the work around the toolkit into the end of the calendar year. Now, that's not been confirmed at the moment. My message to you, I suppose, would be get registered, get started on this. It's not some piece of work you can sort of put to the bottom of the pile. Eventually, you'll find that if you delay on your work around the toolkit, then things like NHS Mail, they'll close off to you. Things like accessing particular records, they'll insist you have approaching standards. You won't have started the work. So you may as well just start to take a look at this now and crack on with it. And it's like all of these initiatives and programs. Once you make a start, you'll find things are easier. And as I say, a lot of the evidence that it asks for, you'll probably have in place already. You'll probably need to just refresh or just bring up to date some of your existing processes and procedures. And then really the sort of final point around the what next is don't treat this as a sort of a single initiative, right? We did the toolkit, we can move on to the next thing. It's an annual self-assessment process. So just like all annual audits, you should keep things up to date. You should keep checking. We're talking about people's data here, staff data, residents data, and all of us, I mean, you know, society in general, we all want to make sure that our personal data is being looked after, and we trust institutions and we trust businesses to do things properly. having been sort of talked about the sort of, the serious side of things, let's just talk about the help and support that's available for a moment. There's a lot of help available. I said this at the beginning. There's a big section including a quick start guide, big picture guides. There's videos as well now that are coming on stream. So as well as the webinars that we're doing locally, there are also sort of specialist webinars available through digital social care, as well as videos. So this isn't something where you're going to have to start the journey and then be sort of thinking, well, where can I get help? Because there's a lot of help out there. I mentioned the helpline, that's very useful. And then there's some template policies and guidance for you as well. And many institutions, many care providers have already started this journey. Some have even completed it. So there are examples of good practice beginning to emerge already, and you'll be able to pick up on some of these examples of best practice and case studies and look at those on the Digital Social Care website. So it's really encouraging. And on the local scene, I haven't really referred to it too much, but we have a partnership. The partnership's led by the Suffolk Association of Independent Care Providers, and we work with them to provide local support. So let's say we know a few of you and you know us, hopefully. So if you get stuck, you can contact myself or you can contact Kate. The easiest email address for this particular project is digital@caredevelopmenteast.co.uk. So that's digital@caredevelopmenteast.co.uk, and you can just then get some help and advice from us. Nice to see that, Tracy. Tracy just saying she's literally just registered. It was really easy to do. She's just waiting for a confirmation email. So there you go. Living proof that it's not too onerous, and you should be able to work your way through this, which is great.
Like Christian said, we are going to be offering some additional support as well. So whilst you have got these videos you can access through the national sites, we are going to be going through the different sections and offering support, going through the questions, for example, through staffing and roles. So you can sign on to our webinars for that as well, if that is of use to you.
Okay, so these are the other sources of help that are out there, and you'll have all of these available to you. The recording of the webinar has all of this information, of course, and we will put it up on the Care Development East website, which is caredevelopmenteast.co.uk. So that is the final slide in the presentation. Does anybody have any questions or comments before we sign off on today's session? No? Well, as I say, I know what it's like. It's a lot of information to take on board, but if you take a systematic approach, like all of these things, then it's fairly intuitive. It's reasonably straightforward, but it's something that you need to start looking at now. There've probably been, it's not understating things to say it's been a fairly hectic 12 months for all of us. It's been very challenging, and our priorities have been elsewhere. But now, as things are beginning to calm down a little bit, then we need to start thinking about things like the toolkit, how we're going to approach it, and how it might benefit us in the long run moving forward. Thank you very much for coming along to today's presentation and being so attentive. If, as I say, you need any help afterwards, or you suddenly have a question pop into your head, just get in touch with Kate or myself. But in the meantime, I'd just like to thank you for coming along to today's session, and hope to see you at one of our future workshops. Thanks very much.